I'm Mara Yale. I co-chair the Parent Family Advisory Council for Pediatric Stroke associated with Mass General Hospital, and we run this educational series. And I'm so excited to be here starting a new season with you. And I'm going to share some slides to show you where we've been and where we're headed. Okay, so some of you were lucky enough to join us for our in-person event outside Spalding Rehab Hospital last May. It was so amazing to reconnect. It was the first time we had been together in person with some of the families that have been following along with us since 2019. And we hope to repeat this event this next May in 2023. So if you're local to Massachusetts or the New England region, we hope you'll join us. If you're not, we are actually interested in helping partner with other regions to initiate in-person events elsewhere. In fact, I already have a colleague in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, who's reached out for some guidance and support on that. So if you're interested in that, feel free to message me in the chat or reply to one of our emails inviting you to our events. This fall, we've got 2 other events set up already. October 21st, we're going to focus on swimming, both from a water safety and adaptive sport perspective. We're going to talk about trauma and PTSD as experienced by families after stroke and early brain injury. And we're looking forward to those upcoming events and really a whole calendar year of them, probably 9 or 10 as we've delivered the past couple of years. In brief, what we're about is offering something sort of outside the clinical setting. So you all know that you've had experiences directly with hospitals when your child was first diagnosed. And we're talking about the whole lifespan here when a family encounters an early brain injury for their child. So how do we move forward in life? Just a disclaimer, all of what we're offering here is educational. Please seek medical or professional attention for your own individual needs here. And including this topic today, which is about education, we're going to try to keep it at a high level and not about any one particular child, because there are medical issues, there are also legal issues in the educational realm. So where did we start? We started with the idea of helping families outside that clinical setting, helping them understand how they can help their child in all the places where children grow up. And we started with 2 in-person educational events in Boston in 2019. And then sadly, everyone shut down everything. So we moved online along with many other educational series. And we're really proud to now have, I think, 19 events up on our YouTube channel. And you can follow us there. I will be pasting these resources into the chat so that you can register, contribute, or follow us. And that's it for this presentation. What I'm going to share next shifts into the topic for today. So today we're focusing on education. And one of the resources that we have available to us on education comes from, let's see where that file is to share. It's a national resource in the United States to help navigate the process. So this is federally funded, this parentcenterhub.org, and you can find your center. So it's the Center for Parent Information and Resources, basically to learn how to be the best advocate for your child in their educational journey that you can. And each state has its own centers. So I happen to live in Massachusetts. Here, the center is called the Federation for Children with Special Needs. And they offer many different resources. So you can have a particular question about your own child and you can call them or make an appointment to discuss your situation. They have outreach to try to reach families that may not know about this kind of parent training and information center in multiple languages. They run workshops, including the ones I took when my child was first transitioning from early intervention to school-aged IEP services. And the workshops are like, what is an IEP? How do I navigate the IEP process? How do I stay on good terms relationally with the school? Some people get so interested that they want to become parent consultants or advocates. And the Federation also offers training, in-depth training for that for a fee. So I will again put these links in the chat as we go so you can access them, and this presentation can be made available for you afterwards. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and I will welcome our parent perspective for today is Jordan. And just as in all the events that we've run, we start with a parent perspective and then we move to a professional perspective. And we reserve time at the end for questions and answers. So if questions occur to you as Jordan speaking or later as Meredith speaking, please feel free to write them in the chat and we'll moderate the chat as we go. We anticipate having plenty of time for questions, and if we run out, we will save the questions and figure out a way to answer them in a future format. So thanks, and take it away, Jordan.
Thanks very much, Mara. You guys can hear me okay? Great. So my name is Jordan, and we live in the suburb of Boston, where our city, and people call it district. So, you know, whether you live in a town or city, but your school district, our school district is well known for being good. So we already are lucky. And I'll start with a statement of what we want for both of our children. I have a second grader, Orion, who had a perinatal stroke, and his fourth grade typically developing sister. And what we both want for both of them in life is to be happy, to be healthy, and to be authors of their own life. And I know that you guys feel this, but for Orion, who's had so many interventions, some of those goals can seem in direct conflict. Interventions and agencies, and in school that can be the case as well. So a little bit of background is that, because I think the transition to IEP in school starts really in early intervention. So in early intervention, Orion received PT, OT, speech, music therapy, and I think that kind of sets the stage for the IEP. And because they kind of look at that and they're like, all right, then what do we need from early childhood, the preschool, the public preschool perspective. And when he was evaluated there, he got all of that. And so those services and a direct placement in inclusion classroom. So partially kids with IEPs and special education, and many typically developing peers. And for us, we had started him and his sister and their cousins in a private Montessori preschool at age 1.5. And we really felt strongly that that was still the best environment for him for many reasons, largely because he was able to be in a classroom, because they're mixed ages in Montessori school, with his cousins and his sister. And we felt that was important. And we felt philosophy, and educational foundation was in line with what we wanted to establish a foundation. And we had always thought to transition our kids to public school in first grade anyway. So we denied the placement in the early education center, but we accepted the services. And that comes with its own benefits and challenges. On the one hand, because you're in private school, and so many districts are different. Like, I really couldn't get a straight answer from like 20 people or something, depending on where they are. Some districts are set up that they really support private school because they don't really have the capacity. They're like, we will pay for the people that we find to send them into the private school to deliver the services. Some of them are like, no, we'll work with you and you can come in for the services. Some of them, so it really runs the gamut. And for us, they happened to be next door. So he went after school, after his private school, to get the services. And being in private school, it's much more transparent. It was much more expensive. We hired our own OT and speech because our district, without going through like a whole due process, which we just did not have the capacity for, would not pay, even though, they were right next door. They wouldn't send the people next door. So it was a lot of work. So despite that benefit, it's a lot of work to conduct basically your own Iep meetings with your private school. But we felt that it was the right decision, and it worked until it didn't really work that well. It worked for 4 years until he was about kindergarten age. And that was the pandemic year. That was a year where also we thought about transitioning him earlier in kindergarten because his sister was already in second grade at the same school to public school, but they were hybrid. So, and the private school was open. But that fifth year really went sideways. And there could have been all sorts of factors. Like, it was in the pandemic. Teachers are stressed, parents are stressed, kids are stretched. It could be stage of development, that he was more social kindergartner. I'd say kind of like overall, like our focus so much, and it probably is a common theme in this population, like infant birth to around like toddler pre-K, was so focused on services and the physical, like the OT and the PT and then the speech later. And then like kindergarten, there was such a transition of like, holy moly, it's all about social emotional, like communication, making friends, feeling good about yourself. Did we really do something that was really like negative by emphasizing so much intervention and so much work for the kids? So there's a lot of like soul searching there. And then watching his sister go through the upper elementary grades, it's now like a little bit concerning of like the holy moly, third grade, that academic, like that gets real quick. Like, is he going to have the executive functioning, the organization, like, and stuff like that. And then I think like I have a list of like things I wish I knew, and Mara and Meredith, feel free to cut me off in this list when I go too far. First of all, if you're moving, ask around for the best school district. That does make a difference because special education seems federally mandated, but is district funded and district implemented. So the funding in your district, the leadership in your district matters. So like our PCP's office, the neuropsych, like the stroke center said, you live in a really good district. That was like echoed. And even within district, we moved within district because I had heard that this particular elementary school had a great principal and great leadership and great special education team. And you know what? It really did make a difference. The leadership of early education versus the leadership of, just it kind of flows. They hire, people like-minded, really good, stuff like that. So it has been easier to work with. So in public school now, first and second grade, here's an inclusion classroom in general education with a bunch of accommodations and a bunch of services as well. And, when we think, I feel like every IEP meeting is so hard because while you look around and think, oh, this is so amazing that all these people are around here, around keeping an eye on my child, trying to bring out the best in them. When they say, hey, we're going to take something away, like PT was reduced from 2 times a week to 1 time a week to none, I was like, gosh, that's terrible, it's working, so now they're gonna stop. Then if something were added, like, hey, we think we could use some behavioral intervention, I was like, oh, this is terrible. That means he needs more support. So every single time I want to scream into a pillow. So I have this like circle of friends now after IEP meetings, we all just get on the phone and scream into pillows. And also I recommend do not do IEP team meetings alone. I did that for 4 years. And I said to my husband, I was like, I really need somebody else there with me just to listen, have different perspectives. So that was really helpful. And, you know, some of the considerations for, I think one other thing that I never really thought, like, it didn't sink in until sometimes I thought, oh, like, why is the district pulling stuff away? Well, they operated under this philosophical, like, least restrictive environment. And now I see it as my child is going through the later years, because there is a cost to pulling him out for a service, an individual or a small group versus keeping him in the classroom, scheduling, what is he missing? And there is a fine line, and that's why the judgment and the leadership matter so much. And you know, some of the questions I ask, like for instance, like who will administer the sessions? Is it a therapist or a graduate student or the aide, you know, stuff like that. You know, there are things I think like you should ask like good questions, but at the end of the day, you're leaving, you could have the perfect IEP in your mind, but you don't really know what's going on in the school. It is a pretty much like a black box, and you have to have faith that you picked like a place or you're in a place where they're going to execute well and have judgments. And I think when it's been really off, it's helpful to call in the experts like MGH, you know, has this neuropsych education guru who we had a consult call and said, hey, does this just like sound right to you? That was helpful. I would get on your district's special education family mailing list. It's called a CPAC. Every district has it, SEPAC mailing list. Immediately you will see all of the, you know, comments and questions, and we support each other on it. I would volunteer for your classroom or field trips, because then you can actually see how your kid is like kind of like in the situation at school. I would make friends with other special education families in the district or the school. Like when my son had one, like a behavioral thing added, and I was really worried and I didn't really know, and it was very new to me. I right away texted 2 other parents who I know their kids had the services. We hopped on the phone, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and I was reassured like by the person who did the consultation and what this was all about. I would definitely ask the team what the best way to communicate would be. Like, do they want, you know, like is the logs like that come home every day, or like the weekly emails or a monthly call or whatever. And before meetings, I would try to ask for like, hey, if there is a progress report or a draft, could we review it beforehand? And a lot of times I would just defer to interacting with a new human being, like pick up the phone and try to get on the phone with the team specialist, even if it's just for a few minutes. And yeah, I think that's, I bring up things that you notice at home because, for instance, like I noticed reading, he wasn't really sounding out that much, interposing words, and it turns out it could be a visual processing issue and an adaptation of the reading material. Anyway, that's a little bit.
Thank you, Jordan. I'm Dr. Musolino from MGH, everybody. One extra note before we go to Meredith Wishart, our special education expert here, is guys, we want to create community. I see it's already happening, but for those that are new here in the chat, you can also communicate directly with other people if you wish to do that. And this is one of the aims of this group, is to also create your own network. So please go ahead and feel free to do that. I wanted to thank you, Mer, again for putting the time. I know you're in the middle of your working day trying to help kids in your school district and directing a lot of people that are trying to do this work to the best of the capacity and resources that are available. And thank you, Mara, for an amazing introduction to the series and kickoff of the fall season. Mer, it's all yours. So share your screen and you can say more about yourself and just teach us.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is me multitasking. Hold on one moment here. Is everybody seeing my screen okay? Get some nods. Yes, okay, great. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here today. So as Patty said, my name is Meredith Wishart, and I am currently a director of special education here in Massachusetts. Throughout my career, though, I've been a special education teacher, as well as an assistant principal and department chair, and then of course, most recently here in Massachusetts as a director of special ed. So I really am speaking from a variety of experiences across different schools. So I've worked predominantly in public charter schools, but also have worked in traditional public schools as well. And I also have had a child who required speech and language support through the school. So I also have experienced the Iep process as a parent in a district I was working in. So a very unique experience there as well. So I hope I can add some insight for you all today around the process. And I do hope to leave time at the end. And I will make my slides available. So I did pack them in some cases, but mostly so that you can take that with you as well after today. So with that, I'm going to jump on in. And okay. So today's topics, I'm going to do an overview of eligibility for special education, and then I'm going to move into some evaluation process and timelines. And then Jordan, you spoke so eloquently about how hard it is to strike that balance. You stole a part of my slides here about that balance of service delivery in the school setting and the trade-offs that come with that. And then moving into a question and answer portion. And so just to kick us off and jump in, it's a complex process. Just as you've heard from Mara earlier, it is different across every state. So special education has been around for less than 50 years in America. So 50 years ago, children with disabilities and with conditions that schools did not understand were actually not allowed to participate in school. So when you think about where we are as an educational system, 2004 was really the launch point of what you are experiencing as a parent today in education. And so school districts, the government, everybody is learning. And in some ways, this is awesome because it gives us an opportunity to completely continue to change and to continue to make the most of the resources we have. But in many ways, it also is challenging because we are still learning and there are not perfect systems in place. And it's very inconsistent, as Jordan had mentioned, across both states and districts. States and districts absolutely have their own interpretations. So some states have more control over their districts and they unify more, and some have very, very loose guidelines that are presented. So everybody needs to follow the federal mandate, but they can interpret that however they want. And until there is a case law that is looked to, we do see those inconsistencies across different procedures and policies. And each new case that makes it to hearing, absolutely impacts those interpretations. And many districts are able to shift quickly, but many are not. And it takes time, especially larger districts, to implement and shift a new change. Even if they believe it's what we need to do, it is something that can take a little time to oil that machine when you have so many schools. I think some of the larger districts in the country have well over 500 schools under their guidance or governance rather. And so I say this to really frame that it's okay to feel confused. It is not straightforward as I consider myself a veteran at this point, and I still pick up the phone and call fellow directors. I still pick up the phone and call my own mentor, and I still go to the state website and I'm reading things about and understanding guidelines because everybody is different. And that you take one thing away from this session is understanding that the system is meant to support your child as an individual, not them as a child with a stroke or them as a child with a brain injury. It is what their unique circumstances are and the way they've been affected. And so no one thing should dictate what they do or do not get. It should really be a process of understanding their needs at a very individualized level. So what is special education? I'm going to do sort of a big picture here. And so all schools are federally mandated to provide what we call FAPE, and that is that free, appropriate public education. And I bring this up because you'll hear people mention FAPE all the time, like, well, did the child have FAPE or are they receiving FAPE? And what that really comes down to is this idea of, is the child receiving access to that general education curriculum? And are they making effective progress? And so you can see how these words also can lend some interpretation, right? So how much progress is considered effective, and what does access look like? And so there are different ways in which schools make those decisions, and they tend to have a norm, and that can certainly vary from district to district about this is what we think of when we think about a strong pacing versus this is what we consider limited to no progress. So you do want to push on that as you're in an IEP meeting. So when you're receiving your child's progress report, really ask, how much progress are other students making? What does the third grade look like across the board? Is everybody making, a quarter's worth of growth through the year? Is everyone mastering these standards? How far behind is my child compared to others? Because that is really going to help you to advocate for the services that may be needed for your child. And so really, ultimately, this demonstrating of meaningful progress is done through progress monitoring, and it varies by school and varies by IEP goal, to be perfectly honest. If the child has an emotional goal versus a speech and language goal, the tools they're using and the way in which we're thinking about progress as a district is really going to vary. And so you mentioned this a little bit too, Jordan. So schools are provided with federal and state funding, but those funding structures do vary. And then the most important thing I will say, I say this as the person who has made the decision for so many students, is that we really are tasked with being the stewards of exceptionally limited resources at some times. And so there's ways to advocate, really getting out even to your legislators and the people who are making the decisions for who's getting the money and how, because ultimately there is a limited pot to go around. And so the schools are really tasked with ensuring that the students with the greatest needs are getting the greatest services, and that it's aligning to ensuring all students make progress. So yes, when students are making progress and they are accessing and they are sort of reaching that middle of the pack place again, and after an injury, what we're really seeing is then services do pull back, and that is good because that is trying to help them develop that independence, and it's also allowing those resources to be redistributed. So there's a number of complex factors here when school districts are thinking about this, but as a big picture, they really are doing their best to steward resources. I have yet to be at a table where anybody is actually talking about finances in any way that puts those ahead of students, but certainly it is a competing factor with all the decisions that are being made. So why does this all matter? So I really wanted to come to talk about this first slide here, thinking about what are the disability categories. So this is the federal categories here in America. There are 13 of them. I've highlighted 2, other health impairment and traumatic brain injury, as 2 areas that your child may qualify under. I say may because if a child has a significant communication impairment as an effect from either their stroke or a brain injury, they certainly may qualify under communication or speech and language impairment. So really the team is making that decision. Once you qualify under any category, you still receive services. So no district is saying, well, you have a specific learning disability, so then you only have access to these resources. It does not work like that. Once a child is qualified under a particular category, any number of resources they may need as determined by that team are accessible to them. I mention this though as important because if your child is particularly high performing or has made a lot of progress, it doesn't preclude them from necessarily being eligible because they have had a stroke or they have had brain injury. They will fit into these categories, and therefore the school should evaluate and should really see whether or not they're able to make that effective progress. And so don't make any assumptions here. I would definitely advocate for the school to take a look and make sure that everything that you're seeing at home and that the medical team is seeing is really being accounted for at the school setting as well. And so again, these are the federal categories. So I'm going to do this next slide here is going to show you Massachusetts specifically. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I jumped ahead there. One moment, guys. I'm sorry. I should just add this note. So to be eligible, the child must be adversely affected. So I'm sorry I did not mention that before. This is really, any of these categories must come through how it's affecting their educational performance. So if a student is experiencing something only in the home environment, it may not be able to qualify them at the school level. It really depends on whether or not the school is seeing that as well. Okay, so now on to how this looks different across different states. So this is Massachusetts. So you can see they have taken the federal categories and chopped them up. And so once you understand a lot about the categories, you understand why they made these choices. However, it really makes it complicated. If a family is moving across states, their IEP is going to need to be looked at again. There's going to be very different and nuanced ways in which the school team is going to look through that IEP. And so here in Massachusetts, for example, it's not speech and language impairment, it's a communication. We've added a quick category called developmental delay, which is actually only allowed for children between the ages of 3 and 9. That's really when students are transitioning out of that early intervention category, and we are unsure of the etiology for why they are struggling. I would say it's rare, but not completely unheard of for a child experiencing a stroke or a brain injury to be placed in that category. And again, as I said on the last slide, it doesn't actually matter because they're going to have access to those resources once they have a category of identification. I know many of you, as I was looking through and when you're labeling, may have children in the middle school to high school age, however. So if you are in Massachusetts, I do want to caution you around this category called neurological. So the reason I want to qualify that is because it is the most natural and appropriate place for your child to qualify as a student that may have had a stroke or brain injury. However, it's not recognized by the College Board as a category. So if your child is going to take the SAT and needs accommodations, they actually cannot have neurological as their primary disability category. So to make a note of that, you really should start talking with your school team if you're in Massachusetts earlier than later for their reevaluation, because it is possible to change categories. And so that is something that will impact their ability to have accommodations. There are other ways to get accommodations. Don't mean only an IEP, but through the IEP process, that is a limitation. And I'm still not sure why Massachusetts hasn't made that change yet, but hopefully they will be moving that direction in the long term. I highlight this example and also want to add that some states, especially in the Midwest, I think there's 5 total in our country, have what we call non-categorical states. And they do not have any specific categories. They are only looking at the impact of the child in general from whatever diagnosis they have. And so I have not experienced one of those states. However, I have heard mixed things. And so that is something that, Mara had shared the resources from the Federation for Children. And I do think it's really important that you understand how your state is making those identification categories and whether or not it has any impact to the longer term of your student attending either college or taking SATs and things like that, because it certainly does have an impact here in Massachusetts. So how do we access services? And so first and foremost, ask and do so sooner than later. It is really possible that your school may notice that your child is struggling, especially if they've had a recent hospitalization. However, it is very much similar to everything else I've been sharing. The process for identifying students as needing a service through the school end is going to take longer than if you ask. And so I do believe a lot of schools have really great processes in their school system, but it's not always as efficient. And so certainly you want to make sure that you just go ahead and ask, and you are able to request an evaluation at any time. I do put request in asterisks because you are making a request. The school district can deny that request. I find that it is exceptionally rare that they do so, but I would make sure to always put it in writing. And often if they are going to deny a request for an evaluation, it's because they want to provide interventions first. And I would say this is almost never going to happen if your child has significant impacts. But if they're very high performing, they may say, you know what? Let's jump in and let's just give some reading intervention now. Let's have the student attend some response to intervention groups for occupational therapy. And that's a good thing, because this is meaning that you don't need to wait for a whole evaluation, and they're actually going to be collecting data throughout that entire process. So I would say, absolutely, you can say no, and you can continue to request, and you can document that in writing further. But I would also say, sure, I want those interventions too right away, because if there is a waiting period, or if anything is, if they're saying this is the process, following that process is going to help maintain a really strong relationship with the school. But also don't be afraid of continuing to put things in writing and documenting as you're going along. Where you feel your students' progress is, ask for that data throughout that process as well, because it will help when you get to the table of the evaluation if one ends up being needed. So put your request in writing and be specific. Due to a stroke, I am requesting. Due to brain injury, I am requesting. Schools don't have the same level of experience with these disabilities as a medical team will. Schools have more experience with specific learning disabilities, dyslexia, types of things that are what we call high incidence. And so when you write something like this, it is going to get attention much faster. And I want you to get the attention and the support you need for your child. So I absolutely don't be afraid of really putting out there what you're looking for, what you need, and why you need it. Stating your areas of concern directly. I can't tell you how many times I get an email that's like, I need an evaluation. And I'm like, okay, for what? You know, and we don't necessarily know, and I'll have to go observe the child, call the parent, and it's a number of steps that really do cause a delay in getting that evaluation started. So if you write, I would love my child to be evaluated in the areas of handwriting, you know, reading, you don't need to know the technical terms, you just need to know what your concerns are. And that's going to allow the school district to move a lot farther faster in getting you the resources that you would like your child either evaluated for and getting them access to. And so you must also sign a consent. And so I'm fairly confident this is unilateral across the country. Every state I've worked in has had, once you write that letter, you still need to sign a consent form. This feels like an extra step, but what the state, or what the, sorry, rather the district is committing to is these are the exact assessments we're going to do. So you saying I want an evaluation and providing your concerns to the school district is that then saying, okay, so based on your concerns, here is what we're going to evaluate. And you want to pay close attention to that because that is your agreement with the district about what you're going to see when you get to that evaluation table. So if you don't see measures of occupational therapy or measures of speech and language or a cognitive evaluation on there, you're not going to expect to see that when you get to the table. So make sure that you do ask questions about what is being assessed, what is being evaluated if that language is vague at all. School districts do not write the exact assessment, like we're going to do the WISC or the Ieps or specific, you know, the BERI. They won't write that, but because they want providers to be able to do a full battery as needed, and that gives them more autonomy as they're going in. And that is also a good thing. I would not be worried about having to dictate specific assessments. But I certainly would make sure that you ask questions if it's vague at all to make sure something, if there is a specific thing that maybe your medical provider has requested is done, that they write that in writing because they can add that in addition to keeping that category fairly open for the providers. And so the district must conduct an evaluation before the child becomes eligible for services. And so this is important because even if you bring them a super comprehensive neuropsych report, there is a lot of difference between the two types of reports. And I'm going to get into that a little bit on the next slide. So please expect that if you bring them a neuropsych, they will review that report often. Some states do not, are not compelled to review the report with you, but they will take it under consideration. And you want to make sure that you're prepared for that additional testing. And that's why, again, bringing them anything you have sooner than later. And again, this comes down to we're stewards of resources. And so we want to make sure that we are considering the impact of the information we have on how the student is performing at school. All right, so the eligibility process can take time, and this is another one that varies by state. So the federal legislation really speaks about it being efficient. It doesn't necessarily dictate an exact amount of time. So in the state of Massachusetts, for example, the school district has 30 school days, and that is school days where teachers are present, versus Pennsylvania has 45 days, and that, or sorry, 60 days, 45 to test, and then another 2 weeks to meet. And those include any calendar day, so including holidays. So again, this goes back to that idea of making sure you know exactly when and how long so that you can keep track and monitor that. So first, you're going to sign that consent, and that should list all of the testing. And be sure to keep your health providers aware because they may also be doing assessments. And a lot of times we have very similar assessments when it comes to OT and speech and even the psychologists. And we want to make sure we're not duplicating assessments within certain timelines. And that's just for the validity of the results. And so your evaluation in school will have various team members. So the school psychologist might not do all of the assessments. You might have a special educator doing the reading or the math assessments. A speech and language pathologist would do the speech and language assessments, and so on for any of the different evaluations that are being conducted. The neuropsych report really does support this process if you have one. It will help the providers know what else to look at, and it will help them to, if they need to duplicate something, to use the right type of assessment to do so, to monitor if there is progress. Maybe you got the neuropsych in the summer and we're starting in the fall. They can actually help to see if progress has happened even in that small amount of time. And so again, the neuropsych is an important part of the process. If you have one, it's definitely not pushed aside, but the schools are legally required to do additional testing. So that's not them trying to be difficult. It is them making sure that they are, again, stewarding those resources and making sure they understand the impact at the school level. So now you're going to have a team meeting. The team, you absolutely may bring people with you. Families come, advocates come, aunts, grandmas, people who have experience. Anyone who has a vested interest in the child is welcome at that table. You just need to let the school district know who's coming. And certainly for the size of the conference room and just people to be prepared in the room, it's helpful for them to know who additionally is joining. You should know who's joining. So you will get an invitation to participate, and that is normed across all states. It should include the name of the person and their title. And so that is something that you should have in advance, and well in advance, so that you know if the school district is, you're like, why isn't the speech and language pathologist on here, right? And so you can also do a double check for them. Or if you're looking and saying, I would really like somebody else added. I would love, the art teacher's opinion that my child does really well in that class for some reason. I would love to have their voice there as well. And so you want to make sure that you are taking a look at that invitation and knowing who's going to be at the table with you. So the team will review all of the data and make a determination. The team might decide more information is needed. That is not uncommon. And so be prepared for it to go a couple different ways. All school districts are required to provide the assessments in advance, but in most states, you do need to request it. And so again, this goes to resources. Most schools are not trying to pull a fast one, but they may not have the capacity to send it out to every child or every parent proactively. But if they get that email and that you connect with the teacher or the psychologist, they'll make sure to get those to you, and you are entitled to receive them if you request it. And so that's an important additional piece. Then moving on, the IEP or 504 being implemented. Again, this is where you want to make sure all of your concerns are addressed in writing inside of the IEP if the child is found eligible. You want to ensure the goals align to your expectations. So if the school district is proposing a goal and you're thinking, no, I really know my child and I know they can do more, your voice is absolutely welcome at that table. So say it, tell them what you're thinking and hear their feedback. Why might they not choose that goal? Why might they not want to push that far? And understanding each other's perspectives here can really help make sure that your student is making as much progress as possible. I wanted to make a note here too, just around that service provider goals might be different than outpatient goals. And the reason for that is because there's a different threshold for qualifying for school-based services versus services at a medical facility, for example. And so this, we always want to be in lockstep as much as possible. And sometimes this can be very intentional, but I would encourage you to have a release signed for if your student is getting OT in school and outside of school, make sure they're talking so that they're using similar strategies and that they're collaborating on that. And then it's okay if they're approaching two different pieces of the same pie, right? Like we want to make sure the child is making as much progress as possible, and making sure they're aligned is something that is very critical. But it also is something that is not always, and I've seen some, I won't go through unique circumstances, but some unique circumstances where the goals are not identical. And it can help the child also to be super engaged as well, to know they're working on different things to be successful at school and working maybe on different things to be successful at home. All right, and so now what? So if your child qualifies for an IEP, the federal mandate is that we are monitoring progress on the same cycle as general education students. So if you're getting a report card, you're also getting a progress update on goals. Make sure you ask for it if you don't see it. Sometimes those are housed in separate portals. And so you may need to log in to see it, or you may need to connect directly with your special educator, but you should be provided feedback on the exact same cadence of cycle that your children are receiving their general education report card or grades, whatever your district may call it. You are always entitled to an annual meeting, and you must meet at least once a year to review goals and update the IEP. The reevaluation occurs once every 3 years, and a lot of times I find that families believe this to only be to get updated levels, but it's actually to redetermine eligibility. So when you're walking into your reevaluation, there is always a chance that your child may not qualify any longer. And again, if they've made a tremendous amount of progress, that is a great thing, right? But you should also be going into that knowing and having a strong feeling about where you think your child is performing and how they're doing across, since the last time they were evaluated. And you'll do a new consent form as well. And so these are minimums. You can always request to meet with your team. So some more state interpretations that I'll give you real quickly are that Massachusetts versus Pennsylvania. So Massachusetts, you must meet in person and it must be gone through, each report, versus Pennsylvania is actually a pass-around state. So there isn't a requirement to meet on each of those individual evaluations. They will if you request it though. So again, a lot of the times it comes down to the parent advocating for what they're hoping for versus the school districts, especially those that are very taxed, falling back on sort of the minimum requirement. In Massachusetts, you have 30 days to respond to the IEP after the school gives it to you. You have a variety of options. You can accept an IEP fully, you can partially reject an IEP, you can fully reject an IEP, and your consent is required in order to move forward with any services. However, in Pennsylvania, you have only 10 days and you only have a binary response option or yes or no. And if your child already has an IEP and this is a reeval, the school district can move forward without your consent. So again, this really comes down to understanding your state and the way in which they are operating, and your district should have a policy for each of these listed on their website. And so the big piece here too is that every state has their own procedural safeguards. That is for you as a parent. Massachusetts actually has one that's in parent-friendly language. It's a great one. My school actually hands that out with each, federal procedural, the state procedural safeguards as well. It's a parent guide to those resources. So 504s and how do those play in? And so this is not an IEP light. So a lot of times people think, oh, if I don't have an IEP, then I'll just go ahead and get a 504. So they are for a child with a disability or a condition which impacts one or more major life functions. And so they can have services in it, but frequently they're not included. And most recently, a lot of hearings and legal proceedings have come out that really, if you need services, it should be on an IEP. And so that's just something to consider. Some 504s do still have them. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Depends on your child, the way they're affected, and exactly what they require. But they are usually much shorter. There are not goals, and it is all about accommodations and access. So if you think about a child receiving a 504, their curriculum is going to be identical to their peers, but maybe they've got flexible seating. Maybe they get extra trips to the bathroom or the nurse. Maybe they have a different type of chair. There's lots of different ways in which you might see accommodations play out on a 504 plan, depending on what your child needs. It falls actually under general education, not special education. So don't assume that your special education director is the one overseeing 504 plans. In many school districts, it's actually the principal or an assistant principal or a dean that might be overseeing those. So despite its definition of being for children with disabilities or conditions, it is actually under the general education mandates. And so the process, however, is very similar. So there needs to be a presenting disability condition, and there needs to be an evaluation. I put this one in quotes because it's not the same kind of evaluation that you might undergo for special ed. It's really potentially an observation by the general educator. It might be, the nurse coming in and overviewing a report from your medical team. So this can look very different, and it's very rarely as in-depth as it would be through the special education process. The team will review and meet the need, and the team is very similar to the Iep team, and they'll outline the 504, and then it's met on yearly. And so when we do Q&A, I can certainly answer more questions about 504s. And so what is an Iep team? Just to know who you can expect to see there is always a general educator for your child's grade level, special education teacher, a parent, your child if they're over the age of 14, and then the LEA. So this is the school representative. And so in different states and districts, they call it different things. So here in Massachusetts, we call it a chairperson. However, in many other places, it's just listed as the LEA, and it's often the principal or somebody who oversees the special education department. And so again, it's got lots of titles, lots of different people. So you just want to make sure you're asking at your school who is the person who is in charge of that. that is who you also want to talk to about if you have any concerns. So for initial and reevaluations, you can see all of the above would attend, and anyone who is licensed to report out on the various evaluations that were conducted. So if you have a speech and language eval, or you have a visual impairment, you should have a TVI there, which is a teacher of the visual impaired, or you should have a speech and language pathologist. So for each different category that was assessed, you should have someone licensed to interpret that. For interim or progress meetings, always the LEA, then also the teacher and combination of providers as needed. But to be logged as a formal and legally compliant IEP meeting, it needs to have everybody that would attend the annual meeting above. Doesn't mean that you should mandate every time that you have those giant meetings, because that can be a lot harder to make headway and move through the system. So I do recommend, if you have an opportunity just to meet with the OT and the LEA, because OT services are a concern of yours, you should go ahead and do that, because there are procedures and workarounds to ensure that those services still get added to the IEP. All right, and so again, you should receive an invitation that indicates the names and titles of all of those involved. And so getting back to service delivery and striking the right balance. And I feel like this is the place that often the most questions get asked. So schools have a legal and ethical mandate to provide the least restrictive environment. And so when I think about this, and when you think about the least invasive and the most typical school experience, what we know from research is that children do best when they're learning with their peers. And we know that long-term outcomes of children in substantially separate environments are not as strong as those in the more traditional environments. And so we want to keep our students engaged in as many inclusive opportunities as possible. And so this is something that can be, that when we're striking that balance, we want to do that through progress monitoring. So the more we know about how a student is responding to the interventions and the intensity and frequency that's being provided in school, the more we know about what we need to change or adjust. So if we're making great progress and we're speeding through, maybe we can pull back so that they can participate more heavily in some of their core classroom. And if they're not making progress, maybe we need to pull them out more, or we need to make those adjustments. Jordan, you're 100% right. When you're missing something. There's always a trade-off. And so more does not always equal better. It certainly can. It really just depends on the need and what is happening. But I would not advocate for having something daily versus weekly just for the sake of thinking it's happening more often, unless frequency matters to your child. So for example, if we think about articulation, there's a lot of research actually out of ASHA, the governing body here in Massachusetts, for speech and language pathologists, and all of my SLPs came to me and were like, we should not be doing 30-minute sessions. We should be doing 5 minutes, 5 days a week, because it's motor memory. And I was like, great, let's make that happen. And so we started making that shift, because that's going to have a greater impact on kids than those 30-minute sessions. However, students who are struggling more with receptive communication, there isn't that same research, right? So it really depends on such a nuanced level of the goal you're trying to reach. So I would encourage you, talk to your providers, ask why they're making that recommendation, ask why your child what they're missing, and what options might be available to them. I do also want you to consider, though, when you think about a school district, maybe there's 100 kids in a grade, and maybe there's 15 to 20 of them who require speech and language services. And I'm using this just as a example that's a little bit more direct. How do we get 20 third graders, the service in one day? Somebody's missing something, and everybody can't miss the thing that's the least impactful, like everybody can't do it in the morning. And so what that really does mean is that school districts, as hard as they're trying to navigate the challenges of that, they cannot make every magic happen in every situation, unless we had individual SLPs for everybody, which again would not be stewarding those resources. And so it is a balancing act. So they're always missing something when they're pulled out. But then again, that's not always a bad thing, right? If that is where your child is learning best, then that is the most important thing for them to be receiving. We know students learn best along their peers, so the school district will always try group before they'll try individual for those reasons. And I will say, just having had experience with children pre-K through grades 12 now, kids want to be together. Getting pulled out in the middle of your school day and being away on an individual level is sometimes very demotivating. For some kids, it's amazing and it's exactly what they need. But for many other students, we do really see that they tend to shut down after a period of time, or they tend to want to go back to class, versus if we're pulling them out with a group of peers, we definitely see more progress at a faster rate for many students. And it's okay to tweak the IEP. Perfect does not exist with an IEP. When I'm training my new educators to write IEPs, what I always tell them is we won't know, how perfect it is until we look back and it worked. And so what we do hold ourselves accountable to, and what everybody should hold themselves accountable to, is it working now? So how many weeks have gone by? Are we seeing progress? So really, I would think on a quarterly basis is what I would recommend parents and schools to be reporting out that progress. So sometimes we're in trimesters, and I know that lets a little bit more time go by, but really pushing to say at the end of each of those, like, am I seeing the progress we would expect to see? If the answer is yes, then great, that IEP is working. But if we're not, and it's, very slow progress, then what needs to be adjusted in order to make more progress over time? All right, and now we're to questions. And I do talk fast, guys, so I apologize for that, and especially I can't see faces, so it's hard to know if I've made everybody glaze over with all of that. But I will pause there and see what questions I can answer, and if anyone wants to dig in more. And as Mara said earlier, if there's any questions we can't get to today, I'm more than happy to follow up, with either individuals or with a group email following up with an FAQ.
Thank you so much, Mayor. This is, I know, a tour de France in a very small amount of time to try to understand such a complex system. And just hearing Mara at the beginning of the talk, talking about the states that are here joining the call, I imagine that the wheels are spinning and trying to adapt the terminology even of what you're presenting. So I want to make sure that the people knows that we will make available this material and handout kind of fashion, so you can kind of digest it also. I'll pass it on to Mara to moderate the Q&A session. And also, if anyone in the audience has an answer when we ask a question, we always say the experts not only in front of the room, they're also in the room. So please unmute your microphone. And when you're asking the question, if you feel comfortable asking it, just you can unmute your microphone and also get on video. It's another way to get to know each other.
So I'll ask the first question and then I'll pull from the chat. So I know that you can ask for reports in advance, and is it 48 hours or 24 hours, and does that vary by state?
It does vary by state. So here in Massachusetts, when you get your consent form, there's a checkbox at the bottom that says, I would like to request reports in advance. And you should check that box always. But I would follow up with an email because it doesn't always get caught. Most of the districts I've worked in do have systems for automatically sending those out, whether that's the provider themselves doing it, or a secretary or a clerk sending them out. But it is good practice a couple days before to say, hey, just a reminder, and make sure, because again, it is helping them manage what is a pretty intense rigmarole each day of getting all of the reports and everything to the right families. At my max, I was holding somewhere between 5 and 7 IEP meetings a day, sometimes with initials. And so my clerks were the only way in which I function. So I certainly would make sure you are asking those and providing the reminders to the district. In Pennsylvania, and again, I should have mentioned this too, I'm comparing those two states most because I worked in both of them, so I know those systems incredibly well, but also because having come from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, I don't think these two states could have made more, the interpretations are light years apart. And so I think they actually highlight really the extremes of things. And so in Pennsylvania, parents are entitled to them 10 days in advance, and the state actually pushes it to be 2 separate meetings. So you have an evaluation meeting and then an IEP meeting so that the parent can digest the material. And at that meeting, if the school district wants to do both in the same day, you need to sign a waiver waiving your right to that 10 days. So again, every state has a different approach to that.
Yeah, in my experience, it's super helpful to get the reports in advance, because then you can take more time to read them and to form questions about them, so that you go into the IEP meeting or the 504 meeting with an informed perspective, instead of feeling like the other people at the meeting are the experts because they've had more time to digest the material. You're always the expert on your child.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's see. Variability by school in terms of the frequency for progress reports. I think you answered this, the same cadence as
It should be the same cadence as general ed, and that is what the federal mandate says. However, schools report out differently for gen ed. So some do trimesters, some do quarters, some do, midterm and end. It really depends. And again, I've been talking all about public schools. So private schools have their own cadence entirely, and they're not obligated to provide IEP services or delivery, although many do. And so it is really important to know when you should be getting general updates about your child, and then make sure that the progress aligns to that. And in all fairness, it's not wrong to ask for more progress updates than you're getting. So for example, in Pennsylvania, when you have the IEP, it actually for every single goal area asks the school and the parent to agree on the frequency of updates. And it can't be less than the gen ed updates, but it can be more. In some goal areas, you may want to see more progress sooner. And others, it's more than appropriate to wait. So like reading progress, for example, it really takes 8 to 12 weeks to gain momentum with a new intervention program for reading. So you really wouldn't want more updates than that. Versus speech and language articulation, you're having daily sessions, you can certainly get updates at a more frequent interval.
Lauren in Massachusetts, if you're available to come on camera and ask your question about neurological disability.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Jordan and Meredith, for your information. We've obviously been at it for a while. My son's 13, or almost 13. He's in 7th grade, and he's actually in an out-of-district situation, which is so we actually do have an IEP in a private special ed school, but which is the IEP is sort of controlled by our public school district, and then the private school kind of implements it. But I was curious, I had never heard that about neurological as a disability category. And of course, that is my son's disability category because it is or was always the one that made the most sense. Yeah. But now you've got me wondering, not that I thought he was going to ever take, you said SAT, right?
It's the SAT, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure he would be taking that anyway, but I just wonder because in my town, there are a lot of kids who have the neurological label on their disability category, and there's some sort of feeling like it's not an ideal category to have. Like there's a lot of sort of, if you have that, you're kind of boxed into something that's not so there's some sort of I don't know, is there some sort of is there a burden to that in any way that you're aware of, or?
I think that there's not so no one category sort of carries any weird additional weight positively, negatively, right? Except for a few minor situations. And in this case, in Massachusetts, using that term neurological, the College Board just doesn't recognize it. For anything else in the state in terms of accessing special education, it has no impact regardless of your disability, right? The other two categories that matter a lot are autism and intellectual disability, and those because of family access to resources and for that child's access beyond the age of 21. But otherwise, neurological, in terms of your child now at 13, that should not inhibit or change anything. Some districts, and this is, I believe, if I had to guess, and I am guessing, why the College Board is not recognizing neurological is because it's become a catch-all in our state. When districts aren't sure and they don't want to get into muddy water with families, a lot of times they'll put a child in neurological, and processing speed gets put in neurological, and it doesn't really necessarily make sense there. But because Massachusetts has done this thing with the categories, it's very different than the federal legislation. It's taken, it just doesn't have the same easy, obvious category to place students in. So ultimately, the SAT is the only reason to be concerned. And if you have medical notes, there are other ways to get accommodation. So it doesn't mean the child can't get accommodation. It just means the IEP can't be used as the evidence for why they need it when they go to register for the SAT.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jacqueline, are you still on? You asked about 504s versus IEPs. So I'm just going to answer that in case for the recording, and then we'll see if Meredith answered it in her talk. I'm going to answer it from a story perspective. So my child, who's now 13, was on an IEP was on early intervention, and then on an IEP from age 3 till I think 7. And it was initially for occupational therapy, really for fine motor skills in accessing the life of the school in preschool and in early elementary school. It was then I exercised stay put, which Meredith can speak more to keep the IEP in place for some speech evaluations and concerns. So that ended up extending our IEP about a year. We were denied services for speech. And so we were off any plan for 1 to 2 years. I don't remember the exact dates. And then my child had a central auditory processing disorder evaluation late in 3rd grade. And after that has now been on a 504 plan for accommodations for auditory processing. So completely separate from the original IEP. So that's just an example of one child. Do you want to add anything about the general differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to recognize is one is about accommodations. So making sure that the environment that your child is experiencing at school is ensuring they have access, right? Then you've got this IEP piece, which is specialized instruction, regular service delivery, ongoing progress monitoring. And so you can have both actually, right? You can have a medical disability and a disability impacting your ability to make progress in the curriculum. Rarely they're the same disability. Usually if they're the same disability, it'll be in the IEP, but we certainly have children who have experienced, have something more significant here with the IEP and then something a little bit limiting, but not necessarily impacting their ability to make progress, and then they'll have both. So there is not inherently like one is better than the other. They both entitle a child to protection under the IDA, which also for anything from disciplinary infractions to ensuring they have that progress monitored over time, and that they have access on an ongoing basis. So they're both equally really important. They're just different ways in which your child is getting supported.
Thanks. Jordan, did you still have questions about the 30 days versus 45 days?
I think I'm mute, Jordan.
Yes, sometimes I can't find the answer to when's calendar and when is.
So that, yeah, I can help with that. And so again, this is varying by state because they each decide exactly how it works. I would say Massachusetts has chosen a slightly more complicated approach to this. So if it's something that requires the teachers and the child, so the evaluation, it is school calendar days. And then, in session school calendar days. Yeah. However, if it's me getting you the consent form out, it's 5 business days, and administrators work different days. So that means that, in my previous district, I worked 204 days. So if I was doing over the winter break and I had to work those days, those 5 days counted, even though teachers were not in school, but they do not count for the evaluation. So the reason you can't get quick answers is because it's very complicated. And all honestly, I feel like the state does respect, like as long as schools are moving like as quickly as possible in that direction, and they're not showing a trend of doing something intentionally to delay the process. And that's really where Massachusetts is very, very clear. If there's any system or process that's delaying the process of getting things out, then that's where a school district can receive more punitive action.
And for our responsiveness as families, is it like on the admin business day timeline, not school day?
So there is no real hard and fast on the parent response timeline. That 30 days, I would view it as 30 calendar days, like the school calendar days. That being said, what the district would do in the scenario of like, okay, we've given you 30 days, you haven't responded. I'll call it the worst case scenario, but it's not really a bad thing, is that they would then file with the Bureau of Special Education Appeals and say, we can't come to an agreement. So the same as if it had been rejected is what they would do. That being said, again, in my tenure in Massachusetts, I haven't seen a district really leverage that unless we've been working really hard to get a parent to respond, and they haven't, because again, we're on the hook as the school district for providing FAPE. So if we know a child needs something and there's a barrier prior to getting that in place and the parent is not responding in a timely manner, that certainly can impact the school's decision in that regard.
I'm curious, like, just from your own experience, what is the best way for parents to communicate with the IEP team or individual?
Yeah.
Like, too much, too little, what format? I don't want to stress out teachers who are already really.
So I think the very first thing is getting to know the team and who's on the team, right? So if your special educator might be the first contact, I want my special education team to be in contact with families biweekly, right? I want them making sure that they're touching base and just checking in. How are things, right? It doesn't need to be a formal progress update, but just making sure that things are going well. That being said, if things are not going well, I want the parent to feel empowered to call me, right? And so I do think if you're not getting anywhere with the special education teacher or the general education teacher, absolutely know who either your director is or who's the in-building department chair. Somebody is overseeing that department within the school. If you jump straight to the district director of special education, right? I've been very fortunate to work in relatively smaller districts. They may have 100 schools under them, right? And so the amount of attention or the quickness of a response is really going to vary by how much volume you're seeing. So I would try to work up the chain only for, you might just get a better response faster. But if you're finding a trend with a team being unresponsive, things like that, then certainly I would go straight to the director to share that complaint, and definitely to the principal. Ultimately, the principal is the person leading the school, and that is true across every state. So with the default, according to the federal mandates, is the principal as the LEA. And they then set their designee to be somebody else, which can be an assistant principal or a chairperson, but that principal is ultimately responsible. So if you are not getting anywhere, go straight to the principal. In terms of positive communication, I mean, I think you just need to get to know them. And your team, I promise, again, I have not worked on a single team where I do not find that my team is caring so much about kids and wanting to make progress and wanting to get to know families. And at most, honestly, they're nervous. They're nervous they're not pleasing you. They're nervous that they're not doing enough, or, you know, especially some of our more novice teachers, that they have some insecurities around things. And so I think just getting to know them and asking them, hey, what's a great way to communicate on an ongoing basis, and finding out sort of how to work within that district and system.
I want to add a note here, which is very, very important, because when we are listening to the process and this and that, and it's very easy to fall into the position of me against the school or me demanding, and my rights. And I want to make something very practical, very clear. You're saying, and everybody that has been speaking have been highlighting, is these are kids, and these are the people they are with for a long period of the day, and these are their team. So you have to build your team, like as a parent, as an advocate. And I think, Jordan, how do you communicate? And you brought up, like, I don't want to bother the teacher. I know they have more kids than the kids also in special education, maybe. And I think it's a little bit of an art, and in being very respectful and trying to do the demand and ask the questions in a way that you really are thinking, these are the people I want in my team. These are part of my team. And building a team will take time. And I think, Mara, you gave another example when you were talking about keeping the IEP open with a speech to be able to catch another thing that you were kind of, as a parent, noticing will be surfacing when the kid develops those skills that are not all together when they're 5, they're not all together when they're 7 or 10 or 12. So I want to emphasize this point of, guys, treat the school as really one of the most important team players in the life of a child. And building that team will take time, and there will be people in the team that are a little bit easier to work with, and personalities and things like that. I think it's very important to know who is accountable for also. So when you do not get responses, you do not waste time, and then you ask the questions to the right people. So I think all of what has been said is very important. And don't forget that you have your mission as a parent and advocate is to build the best team for the kid. We always say in these webinars, you are the expert, build your team of consultants. but you had to build it. So be nice to them.
No, I appreciate you saying all of that. And I would just add that one thing to understand right now, if you're feeling that that's not the case at your team, that you're not able to build the team, we are so under-resourced as a country in special education right now that it's really scary. When you look at the openings that exist across districts and the amount of students that aren't being serviced right now, we're stretching people across departments, across everywhere. And I've had the privilege in the past several years of working in more affluent districts, and we're still seeing that. And so don't be afraid to ask, who is seeing my child every day? And I would like to ask for compensatory if it's not happening, because no one's doing it because they don't care, they don't want to give, but because those resources quite literally may not exist right now. But you still have a right as a parent to know whether or not it's happening, and that communication and understanding that process are going to be really important. To Patty's point about making sure that your student that you're making those relationships, but then also that you're the advocate for your child, and that you know exactly what's happening.
And sometimes the communication itself can be written into the IEP. So if it's if you're not going to hear on a regular basis and you need to know whether something happened daily, there can be a notebook that goes back and forth, for example.
Yeah, I think it's like sometimes the tone is set to that it's adversarial and it's legal, because with every single communication, you get the procedural safeguards and how you go into mediation and stuff. I'm like, I don't want this every single time. I
say we're required to do that.
I know, but you know what I also want like a picture and a bio of these people who've dedicated their life under very difficult institutional given how much they get paid, how much time they have for professional development. I've never seen a reporting structure where there are 20 people reporting to one individual, half of whom cannot toilet themselves. It's just, I want the more human. And so that's why I tend to pick up the phone and reach out to the individual, and what can be clarified with hey, these are the times I'm available. Only if you have time. What can be clarified with a 10-minute call is way better than asynchronous back and forth emails. That is something is lost in the translation. And I'd like to open the IEP meeting every single time with thank you so much for seeing the best in my child and showing up every day to bring out the best for them as a team. And I am always giving you information of what we see at home, but I don't get to see all the 100,000 little things of peer interactions and scheduling and the ebb and flow and routine of the school. So I believe and have to place trust in your hands to react and to use your judgment as a team, because I can't pretend to know your job. I don't have the training, and I also will miss things because I don't know. But then again, you know what? I write a lot of letters to the school committee and the superintendent, and I answer a lot of surveys, and I name a lot of names who have positive, really went the extra mile every year. I do all the surveys of and I want people to know, I want it to go in your human resources record that this is somebody to be retained. And this is somebody who I don't think necessarily represents the best. Because, if you don't have feedback, they're not going to operate on it.
I wanted to ask Mary a question that was slightly brushed through. And in the pediatric stroke clinics, we see a lot of, so perinatal stroke is one particular category of stroke when the kids are very, very young. And a lot of them, depending on where the lesion is and how big, they could look very symmetrical and do motor-wise very good development in the first year of life. And many of them, we've had early interventions saying, you graduated. And language hasn't emerged, not even talking about higher cognitive and learning abilities like math or vision comprehension to the level of comprehensive reading and abstract. What is your recommendation? We always say to the parents, I'll give you this little letter, please have early interventions at least comes once a month to reevaluate and keep an eye, because when language is emerging, we may see things that we weren't able to pick up in the motor sphere. Those families have a harder time to get into the 3 to 5 kind of limbo variable thing that is even more variable by state. Advice how to go at this, your own experience. I know it's different by states, but what would you?
I would say requesting monitoring is the number one thing to do, because whether it's a early intervention program or the public school system, we are looking at a bell curve. We are looking at where your child is relative to most children in that developmental age group. And so if most children don't have language at that point and that child still doesn't, even though we can assume that there may be impacts down the road, we can't provide services at that time. So we can't predict the future. You can imagine we're already struggling to do the current present levels. We started trying to make predictions on students, we would be all over the map. And so that does mean that services end up being much more just in time. I know a lot of people see it as wait and see, but I do think as long as children are being followed, medically speaking, especially for brain injury and stroke, that it is going to be caught in a timely manner. And we don't want to be giving children and pulling kids out of class or pulling them out of these social experiences that ultimately could also be servicing them in really proactive and pro-social ways, right? And helping that language to develop, right? Keeping them in gym class, because those are the first things that they're pulled out of, right? All those unstructured activities, all of the special classes, that is where we pull from first. So we're saying, oh, we're going to put speech in school to prevent this from being a delay or to make sure, then we end up actually sort of cutting off the ability to actually make that progress by having all that unstructured time. So for the little ones specifically, certainly it plays out differently with students as they get older. So I love the idea of asking for that monitoring, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. All schools are required at this point to have a response to intervention process. They are not good at it. That is across everywhere in this country is struggling to do that well, because there's no additional funding for response to intervention. There is for special ed, and then there's a base for gen ed, but nobody's like, oh, let's pump money in to make sure that all students are getting the least restrictive intervention right away before we need this evaluation piece, right? And so they're supposed to have it and they work to have it, but it's not always consistent, and what students are receiving isn't. But if you ask for it, you say, I want to have an update, I want to get a screening. That's a great word to use, especially. It's like, I would love an OT to screen. I'd love a speech language screening. And you can request those as well, which are not formal evaluations, but it is that licensed SLP or that licensed OT sitting down and doing a quick check, watching a student cut, watching peer interaction to really be checking and touching base, and then being able to use that information. And also, and I wish I'd said this earlier, if you've had an evaluation and your child did not qualify at age 5, that does not mean that you can't ask for another eligibility determination at age 8. They'll need another evaluation at that point, but you can ask for this as long as the testing time period has lapsed, which is about a year. You are able to ask for another evaluation, because fundamentally that your child then, if they're here, then they might be disparate in a year. And so you don't have to, it doesn't ever preclude you from coming back and asking to do it again and to meet again.
Excellent, excellent to know. I want to take this opportunity to remind us, how old is special education in this country?
Special education in this country is less than 50 years old, but the one we know it is 18. So 2004 is when we started really funding schools and setting guidelines and putting safeguards in for both over-identification, so to prevent just a lot of the things that were going on. And so when we think about what we know of education, it's an adolescent. And so in so many ways, schools are learning, and every time they think they get a footing, things do change. And again, that change is good, but that change happens in a way that is at some point unmanageable when you're turning over staff as well, right? You're trying to gain that momentum. So we are in our infancy, if you will, in so many ways in special ed, and all of the momentum that has been built since the start of special education has been through parents of disabled children and people with disabilities. This has not come from the government. This has not come from the gen ed realm. So it is parents and the advocates of children that are making the change.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. Lauren, excellent point in the chat. Educate the teachers about what happened to your child can help them keep the guard up and be more mindful in the way that they do interventions too. I think that's a really good point too. Mara or anyone else, should we adjourn, or is there anything else pending?
Jordan wants to add one thing, and then I think we'll close it out.
I actually have like some specific questions. One is like, what is a BCBA and how are they different from like a school psychologist. They seem to
Mhm.
all work on like social stuff.
Yeah, so a BCBA is a board certified behavior analyst. And this is someone who goes through a fairly rigorous program that is understanding the relationship of behavior and thought, right? So they literally are helping to modify behavior at its most basic level, versus a school psychologist is very much trained in thinking about the whole child, thinking about cognitive development. They are trained to understand the brain and the way it works, versus a BCBA is trained to do observations and really look and analyze behavior for what they see in front of their face. They can certainly use that information about a disability to help make that determination, but they are really experts in just like digging in and seeing cause and effect and why a child might be struggling in a particular environment. The psych and for the school is really thinking bigger picture. School districts, though, I will say, Jordan, use BCBAs very differently across, and I did not even, I mean, when I was in Pennsylvania, my school never used a BCBA. And then in Massachusetts, it's almost par for the course if you must have a BCBA on staff. So, and that's just my experience since being here. So there are different ways in which they're leveraged within school buildings. And so when you say social emotional, I can see why, if there is social emotional concerns, they may bring a BCBA in. However, I would say you want a psychologist there as well to help analyze those situations and be able to parse things out, because using an ABA approach is not the right thing for all students.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. And we will definitely share resources that we shared here in the follow-up email and social media posts. And we look forward to seeing many of you next month, the third Friday of the month, for the topic of swimming, both aquatic PT, aquatic physical therapy, and adaptive swimming. Thanks again, Meredith and Jordan and everybody for coming.